So I thought what we do is start with just sort of laying the table and for everybody concerned and just say, when you say two faces of American freedom, what are the two faces? Can you just break it down for us?
Right. So first, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody involved really in organizing this. Thank you, Anthony, and the folks at The Philosopher, Jasmine Parmley at Boston Review, the editors of the Boston Review in putting together this issue. So Deb Chasman and Matt Lord and Josh Cohen, and really all of the wonderful contributors to the volume itself, including Jeff, who wrote a terrific and very provocative response essay. So I strongly recommend taking a look at the issue as a whole and reading all of the responses. Right there it is. And thanks, Jeff, as well for being in conversation about this. So my own work is focused on the idea that there's this dual legacy when we think about freedom in the US. And that's very closely tied to the fact that for much of American experience, we can think of the US as a particular kind of experiment in what I call settler empire. In other words, settlers brought from England a rich, starting in the 17th century, internal account of Republican freedom that was grounded in the idea that in order to actually be free, you had to experience something more than just not facing actual violence. You had to have control over all of the basic conditions that affected your life. Especially, you had to enjoy economic independence and you had to enjoy political participation and self-rule, as well as spiritual independence. Economic independence was very closely bound to the idea of having access to property, so land ownership. And then political control was tightly wedded to an idea of local participatory involvement in something like democratic governance. But at the same time, the foundational assumptions of the society was that not everybody could be free. And this operated in two different ways. Way number one is that in order to have the access to the land to ensure that you had economic independence, you'd actually have to have control over territory. And so Republican freedom went hand in hand with the systematic dispossession and expropriation of indigenous peoples. And conquest, the idea that you effectively have provisional boundaries of the society so as to ensure that people have access to the land, were deeply tied. At the same time, this was largely an agricultural society. And there was also the assumption that not all forms of work were free. And rather than thinking that, well, then we have to create interdependent arrangements that reconstruct the meaning of work, the way that this was solved was by separating between the free labor of insiders and those that engaged in the hard but degraded forms of coerced work. And the way that settlers effectively solved that problem was over time through slavery, through having a separate population, enslaved Black workers that engaged in the hard but essential forms of work that were disconnected from what we thought of as free labor, or what was conceived of as free labor. And so that these formed the two faces of American freedom that have continuously been a source both of liberation in practice as well as conceptual liberation as a way of conceiving of how you could reorient a society, and also sustained subordination. And that in many ways, I see the central problem of the 20th century in the US is a sustained evasion of these roots. So that especially in the context of the two world wars and of decolonization, the idea of having a society clearly organized on white supremacist grounds became anathema in the global system. And that American power, when it moved from a settler project of expansion to a globally dominant project of American primacy, had to construct ideas about, well, why is it that American power is legitimate? And it very closely came to identify notions of its own legitimacy with concepts taken from anti-slavery abolitionist traditions, namely that the US was free and equal from the founding, tied to the Declaration of Independence, later tied to a reimagination of the Constitution, and that what the US produced abroad was a liberal constitutional project for all. The only problems at home were that it was incompletely liberal, and so had to overcome that through ensuring that there was no discrimination written into the laws. But this framing of national identity, what Gunnar Myrdal called the American Creed, what I refer to as creedal constitutionalism in my new book project, what it did at the same time was it ignored the persistence of those structural roots organized in settler expansion. And at the same time, it failed to engage with the limitations of 20th century, mid 20th century American consumerism and sort of the politics of material prosperity wedded to global extraction that replicated in new form many of the racial and economic hierarchies that have long marked American life. And so even today, we're still stuck with these two faces, but in ways that I think are actually significantly different than past moments, where I think we're at a moment in time when people talk about the breakdown of the post-war order. I think one of the things that's under-specified, that's part of this story, is that even the benefits, the material benefits that were supposed to tie to that mid-20th century frame of global power that's economically extractive, that provides benefits to insiders, even that is now increasingly serving less those that are historically conceived of as insiders. And so we find ourselves in a moment, and you can see Trump politics is marked by this, where you have the urge to domination, the resurgence of white nationalism, but really very little, even on the right, effectively, of the substantive benefits of freedom, either as self-rule or 20th century variety as freedom as a kind of choice that you get to embrace through the market. And so we're in this moment in time where we have the legacies of the settler past, of the two faces of American freedom, but we have very little sense, honestly, on right or left about how to actually make good on the idea that all people should enjoy something like meaningful control over the conditions of their own life, a kind of self-rule that amounts to self-mastery.
So one of the questions I've always had with that framework is the sort of replication dimension to that. Because I've struggled with this in my own work, is you see this rooted in the actual material circumstances of American history, expansion, slavery, cotton production, all that kind of stuff. But how do these ideas go beyond, after emancipation, after the so-called closing of the frontier, beyond the boundaries of the export-oriented South? How does it make the leap into the rest of history, well beyond the 20th, turn of the 20th century, and 19th and 20th century, to continue to be part of the cultural fabric?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple different things that are worth saying. So one is a conceptual point about how I think of the relationship between freedom and subordination. And the other is an historical point about what happens to the idea of Republican freedom under 20th century conditions. So the conceptual point, and I'm actually curious I'm curious your thoughts, honestly, about both of these, because as you said, like your recent book, which is, a tremendous tour de force and rightly worthy of the Pulitzer Prize, engages precisely with all of these themes. So conceptually, I'm a materialist, and my basic view is that freedom and subordination, freedom and domination, what I described as the American variant of this story, is just a perennial feature of how societies are organized. It's never the case that freedom and domination are ever really extricated. They're always mutually entangled. And communities on the ground come to understand the meaning of freedom or liberation precisely through experiences of subordination. It's always the condition of domination that gives rise to an understanding of, well, what would it mean for such domination or subordination not to exist? And then you have movements of liberation that emerge. And these are the great left movements against slavery, segregation, colonialism, patriarchy, class oppression, capitalism. You have movements that emerge that conceive of freedom in opposition to existing practices. But even when those movements are successful, it's not as if they ever actually overcome domination. Instead, what happens is new social orders stitch together freedom and domination in new and distinctive ways and produce new iterations of struggle. So my own view about this is the fact that these two things are entangled is not therefore a reason to reject a politics framed around freedom. It's instead a persistent feature of the nature of politics itself. And even if the kinds of social ends that I would support were in fact enacted in American practice, they would necessarily, in my view, still end up being bound to forms of domination, perhaps forms of domination that I'm not fully aware of, that would have to be contested by communities facing oppression, as well as broader coalitions bringing together effectively haves and have-nots. So that's a conceptual point. The historical point about the 20th century in the US that I make in the book, I don't make as much in the essay, but I think is worth teasing out, is my argument is that this rich internal account of Republican freedom, which is, let's say, one of the strongest political traditions in the US and a source for both right and left, for both destructive and constructive accounts of what freedom can mean, gets eclipsed in many different ways in the mid-20th century. And it gets eclipsed in particular in the period between the 30s and the 60s. And to just sort of like sketch it out most schematically, there's essentially a half-century long struggle or more from Reconstruction all the way to the New Deal about whether or not, in the context of a collapsing settler society, in a context of an increasingly multiracial working class, that understands its interests as interconnected and not marked by the old settler cleavage between white and black, white and Mexican, white and Chinese, that there's an effort to think about, well, to what extent can you make Republican freedom accessible to all, equal and effective for all? Can you transform an idea of self-rule into something that understands it as inherently interdependent, not zero-sum, not individualistic, not atomistic, but infused with a principle of democracy so that people collectively make decisions about how to organize work, collectively make decisions about how to organize politics? And I see the struggles that start from the New Deal to World War II to the entrenchment of the Cold War as generating a kind of settlement in which that account of politics essentially gets pushed off the table. And that we see this, this is the work that you've done on the labor movement, where there's a trade-off. You give up control of the managerial prerogatives that shape the nature of the workplace, but instead you get a certain range of material benefits. Mm-hmm. And that freedom becomes very closely tied to a private account of consumption. This is not an original point to me. It's an argument that many people have made about the mid-20th century. And that is backstopped in ways that rhyme effectively with the 19th century story of the white producerist republic under Jacksonian democracy, ethno-nationalist democracy in the 19th century. It's backstopped by American global power, by the fact that the US currency is the default currency, the fact that American economic interests shape the terms of the international order, and that the US extractive practices abroad produce a massive domestic subsidy. So freedom in its content shifts. And then really, I think the story of the 70s to the present is the steady evisceration of that compact, including the idea that this trade-off produces real material prosperity for a broad range of insiders, including folks racially that had previously been on the outside looking in, like members of a Black middle class that have gained various kinds of rights through the Civil Rights Revolution. And that we're living in a moment where the old rich accounts of freedom as self-rule are no longer on the table, but even that mid-20th century compact isn't on the table. In your book, The Great Exception, that you talk about as the success within containment and limitation of the period between the 30s and the 70s.
You're always so inspiring to talk to. You're just like, there's so much on the table. I don't even know what to grab. But yeah, before we launch into some of the questions raised in the symposium, which are legion, I want to talk about the American context in particular. I mean, we have a fairly interesting set of circumstances: settler colonialism, chattel slavery, an immigrant society, and all based on Republican values. So I wonder how you frame American freedom vis-a-vis, think about it vis-a-vis other nations' ideas of freedom grounded in those material circumstances.
Yeah, so I think the particularities of the American project, how the U.S. was located in global dynamics of empire produce, let's say, distinctive developments within sort of the family of global politics about freedom. So, you know, part of the impulse behind the issue in my own piece was that for folks that think of themselves as part of the left, especially honestly, maybe people that are a little bit older that haven't fully come of age during the last 20 years, where the language of freedom feels like it's just exclusively a language of the right almost. But you grew up thinking, well, freedom is a left language. And there's something really strange about the idea that actually, not only are the folks that talk about freedom in the US largely on the right, it's become an incredibly powerful language for xenophobia, military belligerence, us versus them thinking, the politics of white nationalism, an extreme version of the market. How is this the case? And I'd say, while there are global dynamics that are tied to the reconstruction of the economy, the politics of nationalism over the last half century, where we see freedom as something that's being appropriated by the right, it's also the case that in the US, that freedom has always had this kind of protean quality precisely because of the settler roots. And one way to think about it is somebody like Jackson, Andrew Jackson. If you just sort of abstract from Andrew Jackson's politics and you're like, how do I locate Andrew Jackson on a traditional left versus right binary? Mm-hmm. It can be really tough because it's like, well, isn't Andrew Jackson that's like the person that backs the quote unquote common man, supports universal white manhood suffrage, is committed to economic populism. And yet at the same time, Andrew Jackson is also the avatar as well as the central figure of, ethnic cleansing, native dispossession, the defense of slavery, an extreme version of both ethno-racial democracy, white democracy, as well as a language of equal rights for all, special privileges for none, a suspicion of various kinds of governmental power, a dread of state authority, a view that when governmental authority intervenes, that's the thing that's supposed to be a sword against racial outsiders, not ever something that's supposed to intrude within the society. And this complex stitching, which is the stuff that you've been exploring in your work, I think is particular to the American context because of the way, broadly speaking, the story of settlement and expansion brought together an account of internal freedom with this politics of both land expropriation and coerced use of labor. And the way that it tied these things together is that it effectively transformed the dominant discourse of American politics for large chunks of its history into a combination of what looks like economic populism with white nationalism in ways that end up pinging between two different poles. And George Wallace, who you've written on, is a perfect example of it. So one pole is that a free society is one in which people like us, racially understood, collectively make decisions. Strong commitment to small-scale democracy, to economic populism that's tied to control of outsiders. But whenever it's the case that we're no longer the ones making decisions, then all the rules should be rejected. And I should be subject to no imposition. And I should enjoy something like an extreme form of anti-statism that, of course, goes hand in hand with an extreme form of the use of the state to coerce and suppress others. Law and order means I enjoy kind of a liberated position in the market. This is how American libertarianism isn't really libertarian. And at the same time, I enjoy the ability to use the police or the security personnel to violently oppress outsiders. And that pinging between what seems like economic populism and what seems like an extreme version of anti-statism is really deeply rooted in the politics, the structure of American institutions and experience. And that's the stuff that you've been working on.
So many questions I could ask you about all of this, and something that popped into my mind was William Appleton Williams, and we could call this of imperial freedom as a way of life. But I think maybe we should move on to the volume before we get into the freedom weeds too far on our own stuff. Um, and you know, the symposium brought together a wonderful, rich group of scholars. And it was an exciting event, and I think the publication is really valuable. And at the end, you in your summary response to everybody's stuff, you do a great job of bundling the questions into kind of two areas, and I want to open both of those up for discussion. The first one is, so many people, including myself, advocated, well, what we really, and you need to think about is institution building. Institution building is sort of the bulwark against the sort of one, the pinging too far on one side or the other, that and that for the left, especially, that becomes the center project. But given this sordid history that we just walked through, that you just go through, is freedom the language and the route to institution building?
Yeah. Um, so I think that maybe it's worth kind of teasing this apart just to start. So the defense of the turn to institutions was motivated by a kind of concern, I think, that you saw that carry across a number of different pieces with Democratic Party messaging specifically, which is on freedom, but on a whole host of issues. There's a way in which the story that you get from the Democratic Party is that the reason why some of our arguments don't quite hit, so like the what's the matter with Kansas issue, like why don't people vote their pocketbooks, is that we haven't come up with like the right language to use, and that we haven't figured out the right kind of charismatic vehicle. So if we do some kind of dance around marketing and narrative, we'll be able to convince folks. And of course, like, I mean, there's a kind of straightforward thing here, which is like Obama was incredibly charismatic and effectively was a politics built on the idea is that if we can just say these words in the most charismatic way, somehow we'd have consensus, despite really profound differences that underlie the society. And I think the call to institutions is a way of saying, yes, narrative and terms, arguments are incredibly important, whether or not we're talking about freedom or the thing that you emphasized in your piece, democracy. But for any of these arguments to be compelling and convincing, they have to feel organically rooted in people's lives, so that you have to actually pay attention to what Brandon Terry, in a conversation we had just a few days ago, and I mentioned already, called the structure of experience. In other words, well, what are the types of neighborhoods, schools, parties, churches, institutions, broadly speaking, workplaces that people reside in. And those shaping institutions have profound effects on which arguments seem totally intuitive, organically connected to their experience, and which arguments feel out of step. And that a deep problem in American life today, that is a function effectively of Cold War transformations, and then let's say, quote unquote, neoliberal transformations since the 70s, is that there are vanishingly few spaces where the left politics of freedom, one that connects freedom as self-rule to an interdependent and collective story of both solidarity and democracy, is real. There are very few workplaces that are organized that way. There are very few party experiences, electoral experiences that are organized that way. There are very few experiences generally. And that the first effort, really, of being able to rebuild a left politics of freedom is to reconstruct institutions affecting elections, affecting the family, affecting workplaces, so that the ideas feel like they have organic teeth. And then that gets to your second question, which is, this feels quixotic, and is it worth it? And this might be a side of disagreement, so I'd love to hear your responses to this, which is my own view. And honestly, we can see this again in the context of Israel-Palestine and various efforts by Palestinians to talk about their own efforts at self-determination and freedom, is that freedom is one of the sort of sustained and perennial languages that a variety of different oppressed communities have used to make sense of their own condition. And I worry that in a way, giving up entirely on this as a language means giving up, in a deep sense, on the language that people, that communities actually use as a way of making sense of the circumstances in which they're situated. And this is an issue that I've struggled with in lots of different contexts. You probably got a sense of from my second book that I'm a real critic of the U.S. federal Constitution. But it's also the case that people believe deeply in the document, they believe deeply in a language of rights. And so you have to tease out when and under what circumstances are these discourses important. And I would say, going back to the structure point, in a way, precisely because we live in a moment where even right accounts of freedom, like freedom through this individualized story about the market, of being free on your own, that's tied to domination, is providing less and less benefit for insiders. There's a way in which, for all of the nightmares thrown up by the fracturing of our moment, it actually creates space to think of this reconstructive work as something that we can collectively engage in, and at the same time as something that connects to how people actually facing various forms of exploitation and marginalization understand the terms of their own experience and the let's say the horizon of their aspiration. But I'm curious your thoughts on this too.
Well, I mean, I'll happily share mine. But to clarify, so it's not that there's something innate or inherent in whatever freedom might be, but that it resonates, that it has a connection and a history that works. Is a sort of a pragmatic argument, if you will, about the nature of freedom?
So for me, I have like a philosophical, let's say a philosophical argument, given that we're sponsored here by the philosopher.
I'm out of my league on that one.
Yeah. And I have a political argument. I'll do the political argument first. The political argument is again tied to this sort of dialectical account of the relationship between freedom and domination that I have, which is, I see societies, including the American society, as marked by systematic forms of hierarchy, domination, oppression. And it's just the case that projects on the ground of how people end up pursuing efforts to reconstruct those societies conceive of resistance as resistance to these forms of domination, and that freedom has been a powerful and pervasive language of articulating how it is that we make sense of a horizon of possibility that extends beyond the present. And that requires thinking really deeply about how to enrich emancipatory language, and also, I think, being very cautious about what it means to push back against it. So that's a kind of political argument that's tied to the pragmatic point. There's a conceptual argument for me that folks might disagree with, or many people do disagree with, which is, I'm committed personally to a particular politics of democratic socialism. And I see a rich vein of that in the US through radicalized versions of the Republican tradition that were taken up by eruptive social formations over the course of American life, from labor radicals to feminist socialists to Black internationalists, that took like this kind of strain of argument about economic independence, about political participation, and transformed it into something vital and new that responded to what King called in the 1960s the great triplets that undermined American life: racism, materialism, and militarism. And for that reason, I think of it as a persistent tradition, not in a nationalist sense, not like that these people were nationalists, but in a sense of a tradition rooted in our own collective experience as Americans, even if I personally am an anti-nationalist and many of these folks were internationalists that saw attachments to fellow workers or fellow colonized peoples as far more significant than national attachments, as something that is a through line that, in a way, the story of the Cold War attempted systematically to cleave. Now, there are people that I view as I'm aligned with on practical political projects that reject that, and that's perfectly fine. I think that we can make common cause regardless of what you think about democratic socialism, or like the kind of radical tradition of equal and effective freedom in the US that was carried on by various people. You can be a full-on anarchist and suspicious of the state, but at the same time find common cause through a rejection of the existing forms of oppression. But for me, the political imperative is key in the reason why I'm writing an essay called A Different Freedom in a volume called Reclaiming Freedom. But um, the conceptual understanding of freedom's value as a tradition of political dissent and protest is also significant.
But doesn't that put the left, broadly conceived, the allied versions of the left you just reeled off, in a position of constantly fighting back on definitional terms? We mean free. When we say freedom, we mean this. When they say freedom, we mean that. And that the struggle becomes sort of defining yourself in opposition to the secessionist version of freedom that's really about, as you're talking about, pinging on this side, I get to leave, I'm checking out, and the state is interfering with my capacity to dominate. I fear that then the project becomes saving freedom, not saving the program.
Yeah, so
freedom becomes saving freedom as an idea, which I think the vast majority of contributors to this volume believed we should do. I didn't. But my argument is, let's get on with it and do other things. That this is kind of a burned over district and it's owned by people I don't want to I want to fight with or against. So I guess it just seems to put us in a bit of a defensive crouch the whole time, trying to figure out what we mean by this term, when we could be talking about redistribution of wealth and democracy and healthcare and things people need to make their lives better, and rather than dealing around in unsatisfying abstractions that are owned by people with opposing values.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's really powerfully stated. And I suppose the pushback that I would have is, I don't think it's exactly either or. So this is, in a way, getting back to the point about institutions, that I think the natural tendency of the idea to say we need to reclaim freedom is then to say, well, that means we have to focus on narrative, and we need to do like all of this definitional work of exactly what we mean and how we construct the words, and and then can we get somebody like Obama, but even more charismatic than Obama, to like spout the terms. And I think all of that is like deeply, profoundly flawed. That actually, if you take seriously the idea that there's a value to this for either the conceptual or the political reasons about how people just understand their own experiences, then the way to pursue it is precisely through programmatic political work that's coalitional and that connects to people that might have wildly different views about the definitions, or might, let's say like you, reject the utility of it at all. And in fact, I'd say that this to me is equivalent to all of the other ways in which I think building majorities should precede first order debate. So it could be about, should we use freedom? It could be about, well, is the principal category race or class? It could be about something that I've spent a fair amount of time writing and thinking about, the question of American nationalism. Do you believe in the creed and the story of the US as a redemptive nation? Or like me, do you sort of hold firm to an account of third world left internationalism that's like deeply suspicious of these nationalist stories? At the end of the day, I think rather than having those conversations, it's much more important to focus on what are the concrete sites of oppression, exploitation that communities actually experience, and how can we make common cause around shared material and ethical concern around those. But at the same time, so that's the way in which I don't think it's either or, that like actually the turn to institutions and the structure of experience is a way of taking on board your very powerful critique. But then maybe like the other pushback, and I'm curious what you think about this, is if we're just in the world of effectively like political philosophy, and we're having these conversations, I don't know that there's any linguistic end run around the problem that you articulated. So I also very deeply believe in a project of democracy. My account of democracy is one deeply infused with an idea of equal and effective freedom that I see as essential. Freedom, democracy is essential to my vision of an emancipatory socialism. But it's also the case that that's the term. That's the term, as you know, I wrote in my response piece that, returning to Andrew Jackson, Jackson and those around him used for their party the democracy, and that the language of democracy historically has been a language of ethno-nationalism. Today, there's ways in which it's a productive language for the left, but it's also in the US, and we're seeing this right now, it is the principal language used to defend closed borders, nativism, the stringent enforcement of, I think, a deeply racist politics around who can be properly American, as well as an argument about why the US is facing like perennial threats that requires a kind of belligerence toward the world. So that the conceptual puzzles, riddles around these terms is, I think, something that's a persistent feature of any of these linguistic turns that we might want to pursue, and that you can jump from one to the other term and you'll have effectively the same problems. But that, to me, doesn't mean that you abandon them. It means, again, you focus on altering the organic experiences that people have that then affect which variations of these terms are actually compelling as lived responses to their own experience.
No, I think we share the idea. I mean, I think you referenced Larry Goodwin's populist moment on moving from received culture to movement culture, and we're on the same ground as that. I'm just suspicious that the work involved in this phrase is worth it in that process. So, but
yeah, okay. And just one thought,
but
like this might be, it's an interesting. This might be a political or a pragmatic question, because I think it really matters what moment you're in. Like that there's a way in which, like, what moment you're in and where you're located. Sure. I feel like if you're thinking about like the longue durée of like your work and the story of like Alabama across time, like there are probably historical moments where the opening for the kind of version that I would find most compelling are more closed. And then I think there are other moments where they're more open. And that's then thinking about the relationship between both agency and structure, but also the terms we use, the linguistic terms we use to articulate oppression and emancipation, and again, the structural constraints that might exist at a moment in time.
Yeah, I agree. No, I think there's a lot of sort of organizing pragmatism at work here that you're putting forth that I find quite refreshing. And I think we could do a whole nother discussion about the utility of the nation state, which I think might be interesting, about the possibility of a Republican sort of social patriotism being of value, a little like freedom. I mean, it has the same problems and pitfalls, and maybe we should do that another time. So the other basket, this all the way goes, this is just getting on one question, which was the institutional building and the narratives. The other cluster that you had in your conclusion is what do we make of the persistent exclusivities of freedom, and how do we, okay, let's say we're going to, which is typically the case, forget about my argument and actually run with freedom, and how, my suggestion is, bare minimum, you can't do it without a modification. It has to be a democratic freedom, or social democratic freedom, or democratic social, like, I don't know, something. But that the exclusivities are hard baked. It's not escapable. That I actually think, you say two faces, I say it's one thing. I think that's kind of where we're coming from. I mean, is it Janet's face and there's one head, or is it are there two faces facing different directions on the question of freedom? Because I see the long history of freedom, as you know, as one of domination and exploitation. And you talk about the liberatory 20th century, and you're interested in the populists and the wobblies and the Debsian socialists and and other groups. But I just wonder if the legacy of those movements of the left is really contained within the values of freedom, perhaps republicanism, but I don't know about freedom. Do you connect those?
Yeah. So okay. So Yeah, so the first thing that just I feel like it would be remiss if we went through the hour and I didn't mention this is that so that part of my response that ties to the initial essay is also centrally meant as a rebuttal. And indeed, the whole initial essay is a rebuttal to the idea that we can think of freedom as a purely internal conversation that we have within the US without
Absolutely. That's crystal
conceiving
clear.
of the global context or American power abroad. And I'd say we're living right now in given war that's taking place that the US government is deeply embedded in, and just sort of making evident that fact, which is that any rich left account that you'd want to reclaim has to definitionally be anti-imperial, and that you cannot separate the foreign and the domestic, and that you can't even have a rich account of what it would mean to overcome various kinds of exclusivities, whether anti-racist or anti-misogynist, or overcoming nativism, that doesn't itself fully reckon with the ways in which the border and American actions in the context of its security state ends up feeding precisely the exclusivities that you'd want to reject. That the Cold War civil rights story of being able to grant rights internally precisely through the promotion of a shared national security state has ultimately, I think, ended up constraining profoundly the rights that were provided within the country and then promoted various forms of violence. So that's one kind of big picture thing. And then the second is, this is where perhaps for me, like I'll turn again to the politics of pragmatism here, which is this is always a perennial struggle. And I suppose I view the experience of being a person on the left as simply the fact that we live in societies. This is 2024, it could be 1924, it could be 1824, you pick the year, that are marked by profound forms of hierarchy and oppression. And that the position of rejecting those profound forms of hierarchy and oppression is to always find oneself in a context in which the rules of the game effectively are stacked against you and the obstacles are significant. And the forces of authority that sustain a status quo are the ones that are dominant. And that's a structural feature that isn't, specific to freedom and its limitations, but is a structural feature of effectively attempting to imagine a world in which everybody can enjoy something like liberation. And it happens to be the case that the language of liberation has been a really powerful way for folks to to imagine the benefits of utopia. They imagine the benefits of a world wholly different than our own, but rooted in the experiences of this one. And so I guess the thing that I feel like you're putting your finger on that is a significant, it's a problem that has to be coldly realistically assessed, is just the perennial truth of contesting power. And it's not a perennial truth that can be avoided through any kind of alternative conceptual or even institutional silver bullet. It just has to be faced forthrightly.
We agree on far more than we disagree on, Aziz, as usual. Do we want to turn to questions? I can't remember the timing of this, but I don't want to let the question opportunity slip away.
I think that this is a good time for it since we've got about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So I don't know if Anthony was going to jump in.
Yeah, it looks like it's good. Is this a good time, Anthony?
Perfect. Great time. Thank you. So I thought I'd start with a longer question and then we'll move on to the punchier ones. This is from Audrey. It's a very rich question. I'm just going to read it all and then you can take the bits that you want. Audrey says, I've been interested in Michael Sandel's historical assessment of the shift in an American legal conception of liberty, in brackets, around the turn of the 20th century from economic/materialist independence, e.g. artisan, co-ops, worker-owned, to the right to contract one's labor, or rather a right to a wage. I'm curious what you think about efforts to move towards worker-owned economic models, both from a materialist standpoint, but also from a politically strategic perspective. Do you think worker ownership could be a productive move towards greater left-right unity? And there's a little bit more, but I think we'll stop there because
Yeah.
there's probably a lot
Should I
to
jump
say
in? Maybe
already.
you could jump
So
in.
No, you go. Just show,
Yeah,
man.
so I mean, first I should say that I'm definitely influenced by Sandel, as well as honestly, Jeff had mentioned William Appleman Williams, Chris Lash. I mean, there's a whole range of figures that have attempted to think really seriously about the alternative ways of imagining freedom and of conceiving of the workplace as a site for, for democratic collective participation and solidarity. The disagreement that I have perhaps with Sandel, with even William Appleman Williams, certainly with Lash, is I see all, this constellation of figures that were trying to think about the more radical elements of the Republican tradition as kind of falling prey to a version of nostalgia, which is seeing in those moments something that we need to return to. And it's a version of nostalgia that sometimes even extends to Andrew Jackson. This is sort of like the point that we were making earlier, which is there's a classic problem in American life that is a hard problem, and I think is part of why Jeff ends up in the place that he ends up in, but I'll be curious what he thinks, is that all of the high tides of this specific variant of politics were also effectively high tides of empire. In other words, they were closely bound to kind of external conditions that promoted either territorial conquest or that ended up being tied to like the opening up of various kinds of market access. And that I really think that the particularities of the 20th century story and the 21st century story, this is where I view the Black radical tradition, various forms of anti-feminism, various forms of labor internationalism as in some ways more productive than the late 19th century populists. That these were figures that were struggling with, can we have those benefits while at the same time developing a politics that's anti-imperial? Can you have social democracy that is not wedded to empire in a way that, frankly, you can think of New Deal politics and the post-war settlement as wedded to empire? And that to me is the challenge of the present, that we have in the US rich mainstream traditions that folks like Sandel have engaged with that talk about the benefits of worker control that should be revitalized. But we have to think about how to essentially connect that to the truly dissident strands that even with the revival of that work, Democracy's Discontent and Lash and William Appleman Williams, that I think remain suppressed, which is the folks in the 20th century from the IWW to James Boggs to the Panthers that were struggling with how can you actually effectively produce something that thinks of democracy as a principle that applies to everyone in all contexts. Jeff, any thoughts about that? Or I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Well, I've got all sorts of thoughts on that, but I guess maybe I'm happy to move on to another question though, because we don't have that much time left. But so what else do we have, Anthony?
Okay, another question. Let's go for one of those short ones. From Catherine, are there any forms of authority that are compatible with freedom as you both conceive it?
Yeah, so I think this is one
question to both of you.
Yeah, I think this is one place where we're both really aligned, which is I'm very suspicious of accounts of freedom that imagine freedom as thoroughgoing independence and self-mastery. I think that freedom is something that this is maybe thinking about what does it mean to say left freedom. Freedom is something that inherently has to engage with the realities of interdependence, that we can actually only be free together. And that the efforts to imagine freedom without solidarity or freedom with a solidarity that's built around racial, gender, other forms of exclusivity only end up replicating domination ultimately for all.
Yeah, I'll chime in on this. I've spent way too much time thinking about freedom in one of the most oppressive states in the country, Alabama, and so I walk away with what I call a sort of Hamiltonian version of democracy, which is an aggressive institutional structure that backs democracy and democratic rights. And this tees into the question of citizenship, which we can debate, but that that democracy actually requires a coercive state, and so that version of authority that sort of uses its police powers to ensure that everybody has democratic and economic rights, I think is absolutely crucial, and that is a check against the darker face of no, that's a terrible word. I don't even know what to call it. The coercive, dominating version of freedom that that Aziz so eloquently sets out. So, yes.
Okay, so there's a question from an anonymous attendee. Kind of, you touched on solidarity a second ago, so this may link into that. Does the left also need to, quote, reclaim equality and fraternity? And if so, how would that link to freedom as you conceptualize it?
Yeah, so I mean, this is, I apologize if this is sort of repeating myself, which is that much of the kind of contemporary language of how to think of self-rule, to the extent that freedom of self-rule is something that's articulated at the present, comes from the right, and it comes from the idea that one is free when one is not subject to any kinds of external sanctions, and that means that we are free from, that we should enjoy a kind of individual mastery, and that if freedom means anything concretely, it's often in either the choice, like, choice that you make in the market, or it's a freedom to dominate. It's control that you assert over others, which shows your own capacity for mastery. And, I think that this is a deeply destructive way of organizing any kind of community. And that the only way that you can have meaningful freedom is one that takes seriously égalité and fraternité. And for me, the language that I use is a language of solidarity and democracy, is thinking of democracy as the central principle of a collective project of freedom and as ethically undergirded. In other words, the organics, that structure of experience that we've been talking about, that the everyday ethical experience that shapes what it means to be free in a democratic society is a basic principle of solidarity. So that democracy is the practical politics. Solidarity, in my view, is like the ethical underpinning.
I'll go with that. I just don't understand why it ends in a defense of freedom, but keep going.
Did you want to comment on either the initial question or Aziz's response to it?
I actually lost the initial question after these.
Yeah. So it was, do you need égalité and fraternity?
Right. Of course.
Yeah, which
I
I mean, I
wrote that down. I didn't know.
Like
I thought there was an intervening question in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the question is absolutely yes. The problem is, where is that in the American context, right? If you say, what's the American creed? It's freedom. It's not liberté, égalité, fraternité. It's just one of the triad. And so the question becomes, how do we build the rest of the triad? And I think it's by de-emphasizing freedom and working towards the other dimensions of that that trilogy. And I actually think that far too much of the freedom to dominate is not checked. Like there's no counterbalance with the other ideas in the American context, which is why early on I was sort of asking Aziz about the American dimensions of this, and I think there's a very specific history here that is particularly problematic about the way the U.S. political development happened absent equality and solidarity. So the real problem is not, do we want it or not? Yes. The problem is, why is it not part of our discourse, our vernacular?
Excellent. So we're pretty much at time. Aziz, final word, either in response to Jefferson's response to your question or any sort of more general final words?
So I guess I don't really have a final word. I think the thing that I would say is I feel like we're living during a moment that is deeply unsettled. And it's one in which, in many ways, like our ideas of what the US is, which effectively were a contingent product of what Jeff refers to as the Great Exception. The idea of what the country is was built between the 30s and the 70s. A lot of that is breaking down, and we're essentially returning to a direct engagement with the perennial structural problems that have shaped American life since what amount to the earliest days of colonization. And that's something that is scary politically. It brings back to the fore some of like the great nightmares that we've sort of imagined that we've contained. But I think it also makes it incumbent on us to really take seriously the richness of the collective traditions in the US, and indeed the richness of the traditions of those subject to American power, both within the territorial United States and outside of it, to kind of reconstruct what it might mean to essentially have a movement for liberation from what amounts to the heart of empire. And whatever terms we use that we privilege, whether it's freedom, whether it's democracy, whether it's solidarity, that this is a project that we can't turn back from because it's the one that has been placed upon us. And so we have no choice but to address it with whatever seriousness and commitment we can bring to bear.